It's Miss Volk. Hanging loose. I am going to attempt to read this chapter upside down. You can tell I'm upside down and my camera's not just turned around because the way that my hair is standing up, etc. And, that's like my ceiling. So we're going to read chapter 12. Here we go. All of a sudden, I felt miraculously lifted, propelled by the killer whale below me. I tightened my body, keeping it streamlined as water rushed past me in a blur. My lungs strained for air. Faster! My head pounded, my heart raced. Then I saw the light and I broke the surface, gulping in a burning lungful of air. Panting and coughing, I eyed the whale as it lolled next to me, its head above the water. "Thank you," I said hoarsely. It stared at me before vanishing beneath the surface. Then I remembered Annie. A few feet away, I saw her head bobbing in the water. Determined strokes brought me to her side. I turned her over, grasping her across the chest like my lifeguard course had instructed. Then I swam for Fallen Island, towing her limp body beside me. "Come on, Annie," I pleaded. I stumbled to shore and dragged her across the sand. My feet were scraped and bloody from sharp rocks and weather-beaten driftwood. I dropped to the ground beside her unconscious body. "You're going to owe me big for this," I muttered. I tipped her head back, cleared her airway, and began mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. There was no response. "Breathe." I filled her lungs again. Nothing. "You can't die on me, Annie. Who's going to bully me around?" Another breath. This time, Annie reacted. With a violent shudder, she gagged and spewed up water. She made awful choking sounds while I sat beside her, rocking her in my arms and thanking God and the Great Spirit for saving her. "That's right," I said, my eyes tearing. "Spit it all out." Then she caught her breath and realized that I had my arms around her. She jerked away and looked at me confused. "How'd we get here?" "I dragged you. You aren't as light as you look." "You saved me?" I shrugged. "I did what anyone would have done." She shook her head. "No, nobody else would have bothered." Rattled by her comment, I looked away. My dad'll be here soon. An unusual calm settled over us, until Annie realized that she was in her bra and panties. "Where are my clothes? You took them off, remember?" She folded her arms across her chest and shook her head. "It was either that," I said dryly, "or drown." "I've been awful to you. Why'd you save me?" The answer was simple. Because you needed saving. Above our heads, a tempest was brewing. Menacing clouds blocked the sun, and the temperature plunged. A northerly wind kicked up, blowing icy rain and sand in our faces. We darted under a patch of trees, and we shivered, teeth chattering, chilled to the bone. After a while, Annie shifted and rubbed her legs, flinching in agony. Then she touched a large, purplish bruise. She looked down at her scarred arms. "Sarah," her voice trembled. "My dad." "Yeah, I know." Her head darted up. "That was you the other day, behind the bushes, I mean." I nodded. Annie bit her lip. "Thought so. Saw you riding away." There was a long pause. "You're right, Sarah. I am a bully." I wanted to say something, but I heard a sound half hidden by the howling wind, an outboard engine. Dad. I jumped to my feet, ran toward the beach, and waved my arms in the air, oblivious to the harsh gusts that assaulted me. "Over here!" I yelled, drenched to the bone. Annie joined me, and we hollered together. The small boat drew nearer, and I recognized the one person on board, my father, and he was more furious than the raging storm overhead. "We are so in trouble," I moaned. Bundled up in warm thermal blankets, Annie and I waited alone in my living room. My parents returned shortly after seeing off Mrs. Higginson and my classmates. With arms crossed, my mother stood near the rain-streaked window, while my father paced angrily in front of us. Neither of them said a word. I swallowed hard and glanced at Annie. She appeared as nervous as I was, her bare leg jiggling in apprehension. I cleared my throat. "Dad, What the heck were you thinking?" my father roared. "You could have drowned out there. Didn't I tell you never to swim past the—" "It's not her fault, Mr. Richardson," Annie interrupted. "It's mine." My mother cringed and looked away. "The doctor's on his way," my father said with a frustrated sigh. "And your dad, too, Annie." He didn't notice the shiver that racked her small frame, but I did. "You promised me, Sarah, that you would never swim past that raft," my father continued, a harsh edge to his voice. Annie folded her arms protectively against her chest. "I'm sorry, Mr. Richardson. Really, I am. It's all my fault." Her mouth trembled. "I was stupid." "Yes, you were. You both were." My father studied her for a moment. He picked up one of her arms and turned it slightly, his brow raised in concern. He pursed his lips, and I knew that he suspected what I already knew. Did you get all of these bruises today? He demanded. Annie snatched her arm back. A door slammed. Where's my goddamn kid? A man yelled. Mr. Pierce staggered into our living room. He reeked of sour beer and cigarettes, and his clothes looked like they hadn't been washed in months. Where is she? He slurred. The little bitch. My father's mouth thinned. Mr. Pierce, watch the language. There are kids around. The man blinked. What the hell are you talking about? She's my kid. I'll talk to her how I want. When Mr. Pierce noticed me sitting next to his daughter, he scowled. Get away from that white kid, you worthless piece of... Mr. Pierce! My father bellowed. My mother strode to my side and pulled me off the couch. Her arms surrounded me protectively, and I could almost taste her fear. Come on, Annie, Mr. Pierce growled. We gotta go home. He lurched forward, steadying himself against the table. His expression was a combination of defiance and something else, something more primal. Fear. He lurched... outside, my father hissed in a deadly tone. Standing at least 3 inches taller, yet weighing much less than Mr. Pierce, my father was no coward. He escorted the man to the front door, and I swear I saw Annie's father actually cringe. I followed Annie to the door, afraid of what her father would do once they reached their house. Are you going to be all right? I whispered. Yeah, she mumbled. Oh, and, thanks. On the porch, we anxiously watched as the men exchanged angry words in the pouring rain. Mr. Pierce tried to walk away, but my father grabbed his arm, restraining him. He glanced at Annie, then yelled something in her father's ear. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew that whatever he said, it made Mr. Pierce's face go white as a ghost. Without a word, the man stumbled down the driveway. As my father joined us on the porch, Annie slid the blanket from her shoulders and motioned for me to take it. I shook my head. Keep it. You'll need it out there. I'll bring it back to school on Monday, she said. See ya. She took off, following her father at a safe distance. At the bend, she turned and waved at me. I waved back. Let's get inside, my father said. A storm's coming. A sharp crack of thunder vibrated through the sky. Yeah, I murmured. A real big storm. At the urging of my mother, I invited Annie to my birthday party the following day. I was surprised when she actually showed up at the door, a gift in hand. Some of my other friends from school came to my party too. Denise gave me a new watch with a stopwatch and light. Goldie gave me an ABBA 8-track, a pair of earrings, and a poster of the Bay City Rollers. And Annie gave me a skirt to tie around my bathing suit. My mother told me I could have 2 friends sleep over. The ground had dried during the day, so Goldie, Annie, and I had a sleepover in a tent in my backyard. We stayed up the entire night, talking, playing Truth or Dare, and listening to my 8-track. At midnight, we told ghost stories and tried to make shadow creatures. It was a great birthday. When we went back to school the following Monday, I fully expected Annie to return to her constant torment of me, but she greeted me with a smile at the door and walked me to my desk. If anyone had told me back then that Annie Pierce and I would become friends after I rescued her from certain death, I would have laughed. But it happened. Goldie, Annie, and I became known as the 3 Warriors. That was my father's brilliant idea. My parents had gone to Victoria to see Dr. Michaels and had seen a movie in the theater, a western called 3 Warriors starring Randy Quaid. That's how we got our name. From that moment on, we were inseparable. We went to matinees at the rec center, had countless sleepovers, and spent the summer swimming or walking along the shore. Annie grew in many ways that year. She became a free spirit, and everyone was touched by her vivaciousness. Whenever she came over, I couldn't help but remember my mother's words. Forgiveness sets you free. It was strange, but it was almost as if by saving Annie's life, I had saved her soul, and by forgiving her, both of us had been set free. But some people didn't deserve to be forgiven. Annie's father was arrested in mid-July. The following month, he was sent to prison for child abuse. I suspected that my father had something to do with that. At first, I thought Annie might blame me for the sudden departure of her father, but instead she happily moved in with her aunt, who lived on the edge of town. We need a motto, she said one day. The 3 Warriors motto. But none of us could think of one. That weekend, when we were having a sleepover at Goldie's house, we acted out the story of Sisudal. Goldie played the monster, Annie played the warrior, and I played a fair maiden who needed rescuing. It was then that I remembered what Nana had said the night she first told me Sisudal's story. Great warriors never stop trying. That became our motto. Throughout the next year, my mother's health fluctuated back and forth between bouts of dizziness and periods of healthy calm. By the following summer, she found it difficult to stand and paint, so she began pulling up a chair to the easel. Bit by bit, her stamina was stolen from her. Before long, she slept more than she was awake. In September of 79, the three warriors began grade 8. We were placed together in a classroom with an odd-looking, fresh from university teacher. Mr. Foreman was short, very scrawny, with thinny blonde hair, and his elbows pointed outward when he walked. We called him Ape Man behind his back. He wore brown, thick-framed glasses perched on the tip of his long, crooked nose, and he always dressed in open-collared shirts like John Travolta in Saturday Night Fever, a movie my mother absolutely adored. Mr. Foreman somehow survived the first 2 weeks in our classroom, but the poor man became the target of numerous practical jokes. One day he hastily departed for home after enduring a grueling day of pranks. Strangely enough, he never returned. Goldie thought that perhaps it was the chair that had been carefully taken apart, then rebuilt without screws or nails that had done him in. Annie and I figured that he'd simply had enough of walking around with thumbtacks stuck in the butt of his jeans. Don't do that to your teachers. Regardless, our class was quite content with the substitute teacher who filled in until the principal could find a more permanent replacement. He found Mrs. Mikowski a week before Halloween, and she turned our miserable, unruly classroom into one of manners and rewards. She was the teacher responsible for molding my hidden artistic talent. The first week of November, I brought home a special project and showed it to my mother. Mrs. Mikowski asked me, just me, to design a poster for the school play, I said proudly. It's in December. I set to work on the poster that weekend after borrowing some of my mother's art paper and watercolors. I worked in her studio and she gave me tips and suggestions before she went to lie down. When I was finished, even I was amazed. Romeo and Juliet had never looked so beautiful or so tragic. I raced downstairs to show my parents. My father was sitting in the dining room table while my mother sat on the couch. Her painfully swollen feet rested on the coffee table. I showed the poster to my father first. What do you think? It's terrific, Sarah. You did a great job. Beaming, I held the poster up. Do you like it, Mom? My mother managed to smile. I love it. Mrs. Mikowski is going to love it, too. Without warning, she clutched her chest. My father rushed to her side. Daniela? I'm fine, Jack, she reassured him, her lips faintly tinged with blue. It was just a sharp pain. Watching them, I felt a growing suspicion that they were keeping secrets from me, that something was wrong with my mother. Whenever I asked them, they'd always say that she was much better. But she didn't look much better. In fact, she looked much worse. She was sleeping more during the day, her ankles and legs were always swollen, and she repeatedly lost her balance, not to mention the fact that my parents were spending more time in Victoria every month. I rolled up the poster, tied it with a piece of string, and tucked it away in my backpack by the back door. When I returned to the living room, my father was sitting beside my mother on the couch, holding her hands while tears ran down her face. That's when I knew that something was terribly wrong. Mom, I interrupted, is your PPH back? They exchanged nervous glances, and my mother released a troubled sigh. Then my father scooted over and patted the space between them. Have a seat, honey, he said. I stared at him and saw the agonizing torment in his eyes. It terrified me. I sat down and my stomach twisted into tight knots. Yes, Sarah, he said, Mom's PPH is back. She's very sick. The soft catch in his voice broke my heart. It's serious, isn't it? I asked my mother. She turned away, unexpectedly overcome by a fit of coughing. A thin trail of blood escaped from the corner of her mouth, but she didn't notice. It's time, Jack, she said. My father squeezed her hand and wiped the blood from her face with a tissue. I know. Time for what? I demanded. What's going on? My heart began to pound and my entire body shook. Sarah, honey, my mother whispered. I'm not just sick. She turned to my father, her eyes pleading with him. He moved beside me, clasped my hands in his, and kissed me lightly on the forehead. I wish I didn't have to tell you this. Then he said 3 words that completely shattered my life. Mom is dying.